In the year 1860, there lived a small girl of 8, with sandy brown hair that fell to her shoulders, and sparkling blue eyes that reflected the Caribbean Sea around her where she had grown up, with her sister Emma and her mother, Lizzie. They lived in the Caribbean island of Marty, and they had a beautiful but very simple home with a barn and a small farm that sat nestled on the coast of Marty Island, overlooking the crystalline waters of the ocean. The Caribbean Sea went on for miles from where they lived. They could see nothing but water around them, looking forward through their large plate glass window in the living room. Elisa Bartlett's sister, Emma, was a year older than Elisa and was quite a different sort of girl. Unlike Elisa, who was diagnosed early in her life as a person with extraordinary intelligence, possibly bordering on the genius level, Emma was an amazing athlete. From the time she basically barely could crawl, she would wander around with a soccer ball underneath her and would throw it around with her kicking motion of her legs, her arms, and so forth. She went to bed with it, and she would cry without it. A soccer ball was always around Emma Bartlett, and people got to the point where they just thought something was wrong if she didn't have the ball with her. Most people assumed Elisa would end up being a scientific genius, and Emma would end up being a famous sports hero. But at this time of their lives, when they were still kids, their great talents and skills were still emerging. One of the things which really made Elisa who she is was her inquisitiveness, her curiosity, her endless wondering about life, about the world around her, about how things worked. And her interests were wide and far and extensive. She was interested in everything from anthills to locomotives. At age 7, she got a simple chemistry set and began experimenting with different combinations of chemicals. And Elisa was very well read. Her bedroom, which she shared with Emma, had a shelf that was already loaded with thick volumes at the age of 7. Some of the titles showed the breadth of her interest. One book was called Wild Animals of the Savannah, a book about African animals, and she had bookmarked the page on their diet because she was quite amazed to find that there are certain foodstuffs that grow on her Caribbean island of Marty that many animals of the African savanna eat. And that morning when she had finished reading that chapter, she'd gone down to her mother and said, "Is there anything we can do to help find food for the animals of Africa?" And her mother looked at her with kindly, knowing eyes and said, "Well, I think they have enough food of their own, honey." And she said, "Yes, but apparently we can grow some of the same grasses that the lions and animals and gazelles and antelopes and other kind of animals can use. Not only that, other kinds of foods and trees too. We could send boxes of food over to them." Elisa's mother smiled kindly, wiping her hands as she finished the dishes. "Yes, honey, maybe someday." She had heard many of her daughter's ideas by this time. All of them sounded like they were coming from a graduate student at some famous university. She had learned to simply smile and encourage her and let it go. And in most cases, Elisa moved on to some other subject that attracted her interest soon enough. As is the case with many who have these intellectual gifts. A day came where Elisa was simply sitting on a dune near her house, looking out over the ocean, watching the graceful flapping of the seagulls' wings and the noise that they left behind with their high-pitched chatter as they discovered this or that bit of food. She was sitting there looking out, and all of a sudden she asked herself a very unusual question for such a young child. She asked, "What is existence? Why are we here? What am I?" Although the young girl was only 8 years old at this time, she didn't realize it at that moment, but she had begun what became an existential quest, a quest for the reason for existence. Some of the other residents on Marty Island quietly said to each other, whispered, that if Elisa had had a father, maybe her interests would not be so odd and strange. But her father turned out to be one of the last brigands, the last pirates of that area of the Caribbean, in a brief renaissance of piracy that occurred in the years between 1900 and 1850, while the U.S. was distracted by the Civil War. Many opportunities came up, and sometimes one or the other side in the Civil War would applaud any kind of looting or destruction of a ship if that ship happened to be owned by those they associated with their enemies. So it was a very ripe environment for pirates to come up, even people who hadn't thought of piracy, and before you know it, there was a problem for a brief period during that time. Elisa's father was Jim Bartlett, also known as Blackjack Bartlett, for his black cap, jaunty feather in his hat, and his almost Hollywood good looks, we would say in today's language. Looting and pillaging mostly ships he knew he could get away with, he amassed a great deal of wealth, and he became known throughout the Caribbean as someone not to mess with, thanks to his incredible swordsmanship. Starting when he was a mere youth and using a wooden sword, he and his best friend, Stanley Overton, on a nearby island, had grown up thinking only of becoming a swashbuckling, powerful, strong, daring, romantic pirate. Both boys indulged in the paperback novels of the time that expressed a mixed feeling towards pirates. They were both valiant and despicable at the same time. And that combination just attracted Jim from the time he was a little boy. Stanley, too. Ultimately, Jim became washed ashore on Marty Island, and Miss Lizzie, known as Lizzie Anderson at that time, she had found him on the beach and nursed him back to health with her mother and father. Well, as you can imagine, they fell in love. And before you knew it, they decided they would marry and have children, have a family. But all along, all this time, Miss Lizzie never knew, nor did Jim ever disclose, that he was wanted by many governments and that he had engaged in piracy on the high seas for years. He simply told a story that he was a sailor on a merchantman that did business around the world, and sometimes he'd be gone for weeks at a time. That seemed to make sense to Miss Lizzie, and for a long time they let it go before they got married. In time, a child came about, and once they saw that they were going to have Emma, they decided to marry, and they did. At this time, nobody knew knew what his background was. He only called himself Jim Bartlett. He never said his name was Blackjack, the one that everyone knew out on the ocean. So he and everyone around him on the Marty Island knew that Jim was simply Jim Bartlett. No, he took off anything from his pirate regalia that might indicate he was a brigand of the sea. Instead, he put on common flannel shirts and jeans and looked just like any common farmer living in any of the islands around that area. This never raised any eyebrows. However, Jim had a tattoo on one arm, a tattoo of a skull with one silver sword hanging over it. And this was also the emblem that was on his ship's flag. His ship, the Skelly II, was one of the fastest boats on the ocean at the time, and the sight of Blackjack's skull and sword flag, black and white with a red circle around it, would put terror into the hearts of just about any islander or passenger on any ship. He didn't want any of these to be seen by Miss Lizzie, and so he made sure he always wore shirts that covered up his tattoo. However, after his daughter Emma was born, he slowly began to feel a little bit of guilt about his double life. He had told many lies to Miss Lizzie about trips he'd taken with his merchant boat that never occurred, and in the meantime, he'd been smashing ships and occasionally robbing a small island village here and there and doing the things he thought he ought to be doing, and as a pirate chief. And he made quite a bit of money, buried quite a bit of it all around the many islands, and before you knew it, people feared the name Blackjack. A year later, his second daughter was born, Elisa, and although he wasn't there for the birth, he loved both of them very much, and he spent enormous amounts of time with them when he was visiting, and they loved him as well. But one day, around the kids' 5 and 6 year old age, Blackjack stopped coming. Everyone wondered what the reason was. Nobody knew. It turned out that Blackjack had been turned in by a turncoat, someone who was willing to point him out on a boat as he was leaving one day, and after a long chase on the high seas, he was captured by the Spanish, and he was incarcerated in a prison at the top of a large castle on a smaller island that also stood as a small penal colony for the Spanish at that time. There, Jim wondered what his wife would think, what his kids would think, and he had this horrible nightmare where they simply never knew, and he never answered, and they never ever gave any response or anything, any kind of information on how he had died. He just simply would have disappeared in their minds. And this was one of the greatest fears that he had there, sitting in the prison, expecting that he was going to be executed almost at any time. In fact, they said that the decision date would be coming in a few weeks. He really thought about this deeply, and after a while, he decided to write a letter to his wife. He wasn't sure how it would get to her, but he knew he had to put this down on paper because his conscience was killing him. It was the most difficult letter he had ever written, but he wrote it with care. "Dear Liz," he wrote, "this letter is going to come as a double shock to you.